In the late 18th century, the Kingdom of France stood as one of the most powerful states in Europe. It possessed immense cultural prestige, a large population of nearly 28 million, and one of the continent's richest agricultural bases. Paris served as Europe's intellectual and artistic center. Yet beneath the appearance of grandeur, the French monarchy faced a structural crisis that would soon destroy the old order. By 1789, the nation was bankrupt, its social hierarchy fractured, and its political legitimacy disintegrating. The financial crisis that undermined the monarchy had deep roots. The Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, ended in humiliation and debt. France lost most of its North American colonies, including Canada, to Britain. To regain international influence, France entered the American War of Independence in 1778. The campaign succeeded militarily, helping secure American victory over Britain, but it doubled the state's already enormous debt. By 1788, France's national debt exceeded 4 billion livres. More than half of annual government revenue went to servicing interest payments alone. The monarchy's income, derived mainly from indirect taxes such as the gabelle, salt tax, and the taille, land tax, could not keep pace with expenditure. The system of tax farming, where private financiers collected taxes for profit, further drained resources. Attempts to raise revenue through new taxes routinely failed, as the privileged estates, especially the nobility and clergy, resisted reform. Finance ministers like and Robert Jacques Turgot, 1774 to 1776, Jacques Necker, 1777 to 1781, 1788 to 1789, and Charles Alexander de Calonne, 1783 to 1787, each proposed structural changes, abolishing internal tariffs, simplifying taxes, or reducing noble exemptions. All met political obstruction. The king's inability to impose fiscal discipline revealed a monarchy trapped between reform and privilege. French society was formally divided into three estates, a system inherited from medieval Europe. The first estate, the clergy, numbered roughly 130,000 and owned about 10% of the land. The upper clergy, bishops and abbots, enjoyed vast incomes, while the lower parish priests often lived modestly. The church collected the tithe, a tax on agricultural production, and in return, offered the state a voluntary contribution known as the don gratuit, which was minor compared to its wealth. The second estate, the nobility, counted around 400,000 people. They held about a quarter of France's land and maintained privileges such as exemption from most direct taxes and exclusive access to high offices in government, the army, and the church. Yet the nobility itself was divided. The old landed aristocracy, noblesse d'épée, guarded its birthright, while the newer nobles of the robe, those who bought offices or titles, resented exclusion from the highest ranks. Many nobles lived in debt, their incomes eroded by inflation and rising costs. The third estate made up over 95% of the population: commoners, peasants, artisans, and the growing bourgeoisie. The peasantry carried the heaviest burdens. They paid feudal dues to landlords, tithes to the church, and taxes to the crown. Peasant discontent was intensified by population growth and periodic famine. Meanwhile, the bourgeoisie, merchants, professionals, and educated urban dwellers grew wealthier and more literate. They financed trade, industry, and intellectual life, yet remained politically excluded. This rigid hierarchy no longer reflected the realities of 18th century France. Economic modernization had empowered new social groups, while the old aristocratic privileges appeared increasingly unjust. The estates system, designed for a medieval order, became incompatible with a society undergoing commercial and intellectual transformation. The intellectual atmosphere of 18th century France was dominated by Enlightenment philosophy. Thinkers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Diderot questioned authority, hereditary privilege, and the divine right of kings. Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, 1748, advocated the separation of powers. Voltaire's writings attacked religious intolerance and clerical corruption. Rousseau's The Social Contract, 1762, proposed that legitimate political authority must rest on the general will of the people, not on royal decree. These ideas circulated widely through pamphlets, salons, and coffeehouses. They encouraged a culture of criticism that weakened the moral foundation of absolutism. Educated elites increasingly viewed government reform as both necessary and rational. By the 1780s, even some nobles and clergy embraced reformist ideas, forming a small but influential liberal minority. The spread of Enlightenment ideals did not cause the revolution alone, but it provided its vocabulary, rights, sovereignty, equality, and legitimized opposition to the monarchy. The immediate trigger for social tension came from nature itself. The harvest of 1788 was one of the worst of the century. A severe hailstorm in July destroyed crops across northern France, followed by a harsh winter that froze rivers and disrupted transport. Bread, the staple food, became scarce and expensive. In Paris, bread prices doubled by the spring of 1789, consuming over half of a worker's daily wage. Hunger bred anger. Urban workers, known as sans-culottes, faced unemployment as industries contracted. In the countryside, peasants confronted rising rents and feudal dues. Local riots and food disturbances multiplied, often suppressed by troops. The perception that the monarchy could not protect its subjects or ensure basic subsistence eroded public trust. Rumors circulated that grain shortages were deliberate conspiracies by aristocrats, a foreshadowing of the paranoia that would later fuel revolutionary violence. Louis XVI, who had ascended the throne in 1774, was conscientious but indecisive. His personal virtues, piety, and good intentions were offset by an inability to make firm political choices. Queen Marie Antoinette, though unfairly maligned by later propaganda, became a symbol of court extravagance at a time of national hardship. Versailles represented excess, while the people suffered. In 1787, Finance Minister Calonne proposed a universal land tax that would apply to all estates. To secure approval, Louis summoned an assembly of notables, high-ranking nobles, clergy, and officials. Instead of cooperation, the notables rejected the plan, insisting that only the Estates General had the authority to sanction new taxes. It was a political gamble. The monarchy had not convened the Estates General since 1614, during the reign of Louis XIII. Facing bankruptcy, the king conceded. On August 8, 1788, Louis XVI formally announced that the Estates General would meet on May 1, 1789, later postponed to May 5 at Versailles. The announcement electrified France. Each estate would elect deputies and draft cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances to present to the king. Across the kingdom, towns and villages debated issues of taxation, privilege, and representation. These notebooks became a national conversation about reform, reflecting centuries of frustration. By early 1789, France was a country divided between hope and anxiety. The royal government, burdened by debt and mistrusted by its people, hoped to secure consent for financial reform. The nobility sought to defend its privileges under the guise of constitutionalism. The Third Estate expected equality and justice. Each group anticipated a different outcome, unaware that compromise was impossible. Economic collapse had eroded authority. Intellectual ferment had challenged tradition. The calling of the Estates General was meant as an act of restoration, but it instead opened the door to revolution. Power was shifting from hereditary monarchy to the nation's representatives, from privilege to principle. The structure of absolutism itself was corroding. Royal intendants administered provinces, but faced growing inefficiency and local resistance. Censorship, though still enforced, failed to contain the spread of pamphlets criticizing the regime. Freemason lodges and discussion clubs flourished, functioning as informal political spaces. The church, once a pillar of royal authority, faced moral decline and loss of credibility as Enlightenment skepticism spread. France's military, though large, was demoralized and underpaid. Many officers were nobles, but the rank and file came from the lower classes, reflecting a broader social divide. When economic hardship struck, even parts of the army sympathized with public discontent, a factor that would become decisive in 1789. While France's crisis was unique in scale, it unfolded within a broader European transformation. Britain had modernized its fiscal system, enabling efficient taxation and credit. Prussia and Austria pursued administrative centralization. In contrast, France remained burdened by feudal survivals and outdated institutions. The Enlightenment had created expectations of rational governance. The monarchy's failure to deliver reform appeared archaic. Foreign observers sensed impending collapse. Arthur Young, an English traveler in France during 1788 to 1789, described, in April 1789, riots erupted in Paris following rumors of food hoarding by factory owners, known as the Réveillon riots. Several were killed. These early clashes signaled how volatile the situation had become. When the deputies finally assembled at Versailles on May 5, 1789, they brought not just grievances, but the accumulated weight of a century's inequality and failed reform. The monarchy still believed it could control the process. Few realized that the summoning of the Estates General marked not the renewal of royal authority, but its undoing. The political machine of absolutism, once the envy of Europe, was about to collapse under the pressure of its own contradictions. When the Estates General convened at Versailles on May 5, 1789, it was the first such meeting in 175 years. The last assembly had gathered in 1614 under Louis XIII, in a France still dominated by feudal customs and royal authority unchallenged. By 1789, the world had changed. The Enlightenment had transformed thought, and France's society and economy no longer fit the medieval political mold the Estates General represented. Yet, the monarchy hoped that this ancient institution could help it solve a modern financial disaster. The Estates General consisted of representatives from France's 3 estates. Each estate elected deputies throughout the kingdom between January and April 1789. The First Estate, the clergy, sent about 291 deputies. The Second Estate, the nobility, sent 270. The Third Estate, representing the vast majority of French citizens, sent 578 deputies. Together, they totaled 1,139 representatives, a body larger and more diverse than any in French history. Many of these men were well-educated, influenced by Enlightenment ideas, and determined to reshape the political order. The elections were preceded by the drafting of the cahiers de doléances, or notebooks of grievances. Every parish, town, and district recorded the concerns of its people. These documents became an unprecedented expression of public opinion. While they varied in detail, certain themes appeared everywhere: the desire for tax equality, an end to feudal dues, administrative reform, and a constitution limiting royal power. Even some nobles and clergy demanded change. The monarchy's decision to allow this process gave the French people a voice that could not be withdrawn. When the Estates General opened, the deputies marched in procession to a solemn mass at the Church of St. Louis in Versailles. Louis XVI appeared hopeful but cautious. He wore the traditional robes of state, accompanied by Queen Marie Antoinette and the royal family. The king's finance minister, Jacques Necker, enjoyed immense popularity, seen as a symbol of reform and honesty. The mood was expectant yet uneasy. The future of France hung on whether these three estates could cooperate. The fundamental dispute arose immediately: how to vote. In 1614, the Estates General had voted by order, each estate having one collective vote. That method guaranteed the clergy and nobility could outvote the Third Estate 2-1, despite representing less than 5% of the population. The Third Estate, now politically conscious and supported by much of public opinion, demanded voting by head, each deputy casting an individual vote. This system would give the Third Estate numerical dominance. The king and his ministers avoided the issue, hoping the estates would reconcile it themselves. They did not. The clergy and nobility, determined to protect their privileges, resisted any change. The Third Estate, frustrated by procedural delays and arrogance from the privileged orders, began to act independently. By June, patience was exhausted. On June 17, 1789, after weeks of stalemate, the deputies of the Third Estate took a historic step. By a majority vote, they declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the majority of the nation. A few liberal clergy and nobles soon joined them. This declaration transformed the political meaning of the Estates General. Sovereignty no longer flowed from the king's authority, but from the nation's collective will. The language was revolutionary. The deputies proclaimed that taxes could no longer be levied without their consent, and that their decrees were binding on all French citizens. In that single act, the political order of absolute monarchy was challenged by the principle of national sovereignty. Louis XVI, alarmed but uncertain, attempted to reassert control. On June 20th, he ordered the hall where the deputies met to be locked, ostensibly for preparations for a royal session. The deputies interpreted this as an attempt to dissolve their assembly. Refusing to disperse, they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court, Jeu de Paume, in Versailles. There, 577 deputies took an oath never to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require, until the constitution of the kingdom is established and consolidated on firm foundations. This became known as the Tennis Court Oath, one of the defining moments of the revolution. It marked the first formal act of collective defiance against royal authority. The deputies did not yet reject monarchy itself. They sought constitutional limits, not abolition. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The people's representatives, bound by oath, placed national law above the king's will. The tennis court oath electrified France. Crowds gathered outside the hall, cheering the deputies as heroes. Pamphlets spread their declarations across Paris and beyond. Newspapers portrayed them as defenders of liberty and justice. Even some members of the clergy and nobility privately sympathized. Louis XVI reacted indecisively. He announced a royal session for June 23rd, intending to restore control by presenting his own reform plan. He promised equality of taxation, periodic meetings of the Estates General, and freedom of the press, concessions that might have seemed generous a year earlier but now appeared insufficient. Crucially, he insisted that the three estates continue to meet separately. When the king ordered the deputies to dissolve, Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Count of Mirabeau, a charismatic orator of the Third Estate, replied that they would only leave at the point of bayonets. The assembly remained seated in silence. Defiance became legitimacy. The standoff could have ended in repression, but the situation in Paris restrained the king. Popular anger was rising. Rumors of troop movements near the capital spread fear of a royal coup. Necker, the popular finance minister, urged compromise. On June 27th, under pressure from advisors and fearing disorder, Louis XVI capitulated. He ordered the remaining clergy and nobles to join the National Assembly. The political center of gravity had shifted permanently. In less than 6 weeks, power had passed from monarchy to representation. The Estates General ceased to exist. The National Assembly now stood as France's legitimate legislative body. The creation of the National Assembly was more than an administrative change. It redefined sovereignty. France no longer operated on the assumption that authority came from divine right. The Assembly claimed to act in the name of the people, a radical notion that placed citizenship, not birth, at the core of political identity. The deputies began drafting the foundations of a constitution. They discussed how to reorganize France's administrative divisions, the limits of royal power, and the legal status of citizens. Though progress was slow, the very process of deliberation embodied a new political culture based on law and reason, rather than royal decree. Outside Versailles, excitement mixed with anxiety. Pamphlets circulated daily. One estimate suggests that between May and July 1789, over 2,000 political pamphlets were printed in Paris alone. Political clubs formed rapidly, such as the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, which would later become the Jacobin Club. Public debate, once confined to salons, now fills streets and taverns. France had discovered politics. Several individuals emerged as crucial leaders during these early months. Abbé Sieyès, whose pamphlet What is the Third Estate had captured the revolutionary mood, became one of the intellectual architects of the Assembly's transformation. Mirabeau, though a noble by birth, became the voice of moderation, advocating for a constitutional monarchy modeled after Britain. Jean-Sylvain Bailly, astronomer and president of the National Assembly, administered the tennis court oath, symbolizing reason and civic virtue guiding politics. Louis XVI, meanwhile, appeared increasingly isolated. His court at Versailles was divided between reactionaries urging force and moderates pleading for reconciliation. The Queen distrusted the Assembly, seeing it as a direct assault on royal authority. Necker, though still popular, found himself trapped between both sides, too cautious for reformers, too liberal for conservatives. While debates continued in Versailles, the situation in Paris grew volatile. The capital faced economic distress. Bread prices remained high, unemployment spread, and fear of military repression mounted. By mid-June, 30,000 royal troops were stationed near the city. The presence of foreign mercenary regiments, such as the Swiss Guards and German troops, deepened suspicion that the king planned to dissolve the assembly by force. Crowds began forming around political agitators like Camille Desmoulins, who urged citizens to defend their liberties. Newspapers and pamphlets denounced aristocratic plots. The mood shifted from reformist optimism to revolutionary determination. The crisis reached its tipping point in early July 1789. On July 11th, Louis XVI dismissed Jacques Necker, whose moderate reformism had reassured both the Assembly and the public. His removal was perceived as a prelude to a royal crackdown. In Paris, anger erupted. Demonstrations filled the streets, calling for Necker's reinstatement. The city's militia sympathized with the people. Within days, violence spread. Barricades appeared. The citizens began to arm themselves. The National Assembly, meanwhile, continued its constitutional deliberations, but events in the streets would soon overtake them. The political revolution begun in Versailles was about to ignite a social explosion in Paris. The events of May and June 1789 marked the transition from royal reform to revolution. What began as an attempt to resolve a fiscal crisis through consultation evolved into a struggle over sovereignty itself. The tennis court oath and the creation of the National Assembly established principles that would define modern politics: popular sovereignty, the idea that political authority derives from the nation, not a monarch; representation, the notion that deputies act on behalf of citizens; constitutionalism, the commitment to define government by written law. These principles inspired not only France, but also reform movements across Europe. Monarchs and aristocrats watched anxiously, aware that the French precedent could threaten their own rule. The revolution had begun as a domestic event, but was already international in its implications. As the summer of 1789 advanced, the fragile equilibrium between king and nation would break completely. The Assembly's defiance had set the stage, but it would be the streets of Paris, not the halls of Versailles, that delivered the next decisive blow. The confrontation between people and monarchy would soon explode into open revolution, the storming of the Bastille just weeks away. By the summer of 1789, France stood on the edge of collapse. The monarchy's authority was fading. The National Assembly had claimed legitimacy, and Paris simmered with fear and anger. Prices soared, bread was scarce, and the dismissal of Jacques Necker on July 11th, 1789 shattered public trust. To many, Necker symbolized moderation and reform. His removal was read as a declaration of war by the court against the people. Rumors spread that royal troops were converging on Paris to dissolve the Assembly and arrest reformist leaders. The presence of foreign mercenary regiments near the capital, Swiss, German, and Austrian soldiers loyal to the king, deepened suspicion. The capital's citizens, already restless, now felt cornered. On July 12, 1789, news of Necker's dismissal reached Paris. Crowds gathered in the Palais Royal, a public garden and center of political discussion. The young journalist Camille Desmoulins climbed onto a table and called on the people to arm themselves. His words ignited the crowd. They tore leaves from trees as makeshift banners and marched through the streets shouting, "To arms! To arms! The aristocrats are plotting against us." By evening, demonstrations spread through the city. Mobs attacked customs houses, symbols of royal taxation. Soldiers of the Gardes Françaises, the king's own infantry stationed in Paris, began to desert and join the people. This defection was critical. It meant the king could no longer rely on his Paris garrison. On July 13th, the city was in open revolt. Citizens broke into armories and blacksmith shops searching for weapons. The Hôtel des Invalides, a veterans' hospital storing military supplies, was stormed. The crowd seized around 30,000 muskets and several cannons, but found little gunpowder. Rumors spread that a large cache was kept in the Bastille, an old fortress prison east of the city. The Bastille, built in the 14th century, had long ceased to be a major prison, but it symbolized royal despotism. Its thick walls, guarded towers, and secret cells embodied the monarchy's power to imprison without trial under lettre de cachet. By 1789, it held only 7 prisoners. For forgers, 2 nobles detained at family request, and 1 alleged lunatic. But its presence in the Paris skyline carried immense political meaning. On the morning of July 14, 1789, thousands of Parisians gathered around the fortress demanding gunpowder and arms. The commander, Bernard-René Delaunay, tried to negotiate but grew nervous as the crowd swelled. The situation escalated when the people forced the outer gate. Shots were fired from both sides. For hours, smoke and gunfire filled the narrow streets around the fortress. The Gardes Françaises arrived with cannons to support the crowd. Delaunay, realizing further resistance was hopeless, surrendered in the afternoon. The attackers entered, released the prisoners, and seized the powder. In the chaos that followed, Delaunay and several of his guards were killed. His head was paraded through the streets on a pike, a grim sign that royal authority had lost its aura of fear. The storming of the Bastille marked the first decisive act of violence in the French Revolution. Politically, it destroyed the king's credibility. Practically, it gave the people control of Paris. Symbolically, it announced that the era of arbitrary royal power was over. News of the Bastille's fall spread rapidly. Church bells rang, and the city erupted in celebration. The Comite Permanent, formed by Parisian representatives, assumed control of municipal affairs. To maintain order, a citizen militia was organized, the National Guard, commanded by Marquis de Lafayette, a veteran of the American Revolution and advocate of constitutional liberty. The tricolor cockade, blue and red for Paris, white for the monarchy, became the National Guard's emblem and later the flag of France itself. The capital, once under royal administration, now governed itself. Louis XVI, unaware of the full scale of events, wrote in his diary for July 14th, nothing. When informed the next morning of the Bastille's capture, he asked, "Is it a revolt?" The Duke of La Rochefoucauld replied, "No, sire, it is a revolution." The king had little choice but to yield. On July 15th, he reinstated Necker as finance minister and ordered the withdrawal of royal troops from Paris. 2 days later, Louis traveled to the city, escorted by Lafayette and greeted by massive crowds. Wearing a tricolor cockade, he appeared on the balcony of the Hôtel de Ville. The gesture temporarily calmed tensions, but it also confirmed that sovereignty had shifted from the palace to the people. In Versailles, the National Assembly watched these developments with caution. The deputies had not called for insurrection, but the fall of the Bastille strengthened their hand. The king could no longer dissolve them by force. Encouraged by events in Paris, similar movements erupted across France. Towns and provinces established local committees, often declaring loyalty to the assembly rather than the crown. Royal officials fled. The central government disintegrated within weeks. While the political revolution gained momentum, a wave of panic swept the countryside that same summer, the Great Fear. Between July and August 1789, rumors of aristocratic plots spread through rural France. Peasants heard that nobles were hiring bands of brigands to destroy crops and punish rebellious villages. In reality, no such conspiracy existed, but fear of famine and retaliation created mass hysteria. Armed peasants formed militias and attacked manorial estates, burning tax records, destroying feudal documents, and demanding the abolition of dues. In some regions, they stormed chateaus, forcing landlords to flee. Church tithe barns were looted. The countryside, already tense from years of bad harvests, became the scene of spontaneous revolt. The Great Fear reflected not mere panic, but centuries of accumulated resentment. Rural peasants bore the heaviest tax burden: the taille, the gabelle, salt tax, feudal dues, and church tithes. They saw the revolution in Paris as a chance to end these injustices. Their actions, though violent, accelerated the destruction of the old order. The National Assembly, alarmed by reports of unrest, realized that reform could no longer be delayed. On the night of August 4th, 1789, one of the most dramatic sessions in French history unfolded. Noble deputies, some sincerely and others under pressure, rose to renounce their feudal rights. One by one, privileges collapsed. The Assembly voted to abolish feudal dues and manorial rights, exclusive hunting and fishing privileges, clerical tithes, tax exemptions for nobility and clergy, sale of offices and titles. These resolutions became known as the August Decrees. Within a single night, France's feudal system, rooted in centuries of hierarchy, was legally dismantled. The revolution had moved from political reform to social transformation. The decrees declared all citizens equal before the law and opened public office to talent rather than birth. They also announced that compensation would be paid for lost feudal dues, but in practice, most peasants ignored this clause. Across rural France, symbolic acts of liberation, burning manorial archives, seizing communal lands, continued through the summer. Encouraged by these events, the Assembly began drafting a charter of fundamental rights. On August 26, 1789, it adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Inspired by Enlightenment philosophy and the American Declaration of Independence, it proclaimed principles that would become the foundation of modern democracy. Key articles included: Article 1. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Article 3. The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. Article 6. Law is the expression of the general will. The Declaration guaranteed freedom of speech, religion, and property. It abolished arbitrary arrest and taxation without representation. These rights were universal in theory, though not yet extended to women, slaves, or colonial subjects. Still, they represented a profound break from monarchy and privilege. Louis XVI publicly accepted the August Decrees and the Declaration in early October, but his sincerity was doubted. The royal family remained in Versailles, increasingly surrounded by hostile crowds. Rumors of lavish banquets and insults to the tricolor cockaded by royal guards enraged Parisians. The Assembly's authority depended on the king's cooperation, yet every gesture from the court seemed to signal resistance. The revolutionaries faced a dilemma. Could France remain a monarchy when its king appeared unwilling to accept constitutional limits? The fall of the Bastille shocked Europe. Monarchs and aristocrats viewed it as a warning. Newspapers across the continent described the uprising with both fascination and fear. In Britain, reformers praised the French people's courage, while conservatives like Edmund Burke warned that the destruction of order would lead to chaos. In neighboring monarchies, Austria, Prussia, and Spain, governments tightened censorship and surveillance. Yet, revolutionary ideas spread rapidly through pamphlets and correspondence. The language of rights, nation, and constitution entered public debate across Europe. By the end of August 1789, the political landscape of France had been completely transformed. The monarchy had lost control of the army and the capital. The National Assembly had assumed legislative authority. Feudalism had been legally abolished. A Declaration of Universal Rights had redefined citizenship. These developments created both momentum and instability. The revolution now had to institutionalize its achievements, writing a constitution, stabilizing the economy, and defining the king's role. But distrust between the crown and the assembly deepened. The events of July and August 1789 marked the revolution's irreversible phase. Power had passed from monarchy to nation, not by decree but by collective action. Armed citizens, rebellious peasants, and determined deputies. The Ancien Regime, the old order of hereditary privilege and divine monarchy, was collapsing before the eyes of Europe. The next phase would test whether the revolution could build a durable system of governance. The National Assembly had proclaimed liberty and equality, but hunger persisted, finances were still ruined, and the king's loyalty remained uncertain. The question now shifted from what to destroy to what to build. The coming months would see that tension erupt again, in the streets of Paris and in the Palace of Versailles. The fall of the Bastille had rewritten France's balance of power. The National Assembly stood as the nation's moral authority, while King Louis XVI remained the symbolic head of state, powerful in title but paralyzed in action. Yet the revolution, though triumphant in Paris, was far from secure. Famine lingered, the economy bled, and France's old institutions fought to survive beneath the surface. By the close of 1789, political tension and hunger fused into a new confrontation that would drag the monarchy from Versailles to Paris, placing it under the watchful eyes of the people it had once ruled unchallenged. The summer's euphoria had not solved the food crisis. Bread, the staple of the French diet, remained scarce and expensive. Bad harvests from 1788 and logistical chaos from the collapsing administration crippled supply. In Paris, a loaf of bread could cost nearly a full day's wage. Women, who bore the brunt of feeding families, grew desperate. Markets overflowed with anger. Pamphlets accused royal hoarders and aristocrats of conspiring to starve the poor. Rumors multiplied that the court held feasts while the people starved, that royal troops planned to march on the capital. Then, in early October 1789, an incident poured fuel on the fire. On October 1st, 1789, the Flanders Regiment arrived at Versailles to reinforce security. That evening, officers of the king's bodyguard hosted a banquet for the newcomers. The event, held in the Royal Opera House, turned political. Amid wine and patriotic songs, someone produced a white royal cockade, the Bourbon symbol, and trampled on the tricolor emblem of the revolution. Word of the banquet reached Paris almost instantly, but distorted. Many believed that the royal family itself had mocked the revolution and toasted to its downfall. The public's patience snapped. At dawn on October 5, 1789, thousands of women gathered in the Halles Market of Paris, shouting for bread. Armed with pikes, muskets, and kitchen knives, they marched toward Versailles. Nearly 20 kilometers away, through driving rain, men joined along the route, including members of the National Guard. The crowd reached Versailles by afternoon, swelling to tens of thousands. They demanded to see the king and the assembly. Inside the palace, panic spread. That night, some demonstrators broke into the palace gates. 2 guards were killed before Lafayette, and the National Guard restored order. The next morning, the king appeared on the balcony with his family. At the urging of Lafayette, he accepted the Assembly's decrees and promised to move to Paris. On October 6, 1789, a slow, massive procession escorted the royal family back to the capital. Wagons of flour followed behind them, an image both symbolic and humiliating. The crowd chanted, "We are bringing the baker's wife, and the baker's boy." They arrived at the Tuileries Palace, a former royal residence in central Paris, which would serve as the family's new prison-like home for the next several years. The move shifted the center of power permanently from Versailles to Paris. The king was now physically under the watch of the revolutionaries. The assembly soon followed, relocating to the city to continue its work. By 1790, the assembly had turned its attention to France's other great pillar of power, the Catholic Church. The church owned roughly 10% of the land in France and collected tithes from peasants. Its wealth and influence made it both a financial resource and a political threat. In November 1789, church lands were nationalized to address the financial crisis. These biens nationaux, national properties, were sold to raise revenue and back a new paper currency, the assignat. Next came structural reform. On July 12, 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy was passed, reorganizing the church under state authority. Bishops and priests would now be elected by citizens, and clergy had to swear loyalty to the Constitution rather than the Pope. This measure divided the nation. About half of the clergy refused the oath, becoming known as non-juring priests. The Pope, Pius VI, condemned the act, and religious unity collapsed. In rural France, where faith ran deep, resentment against Parisian lawmakers grew. The revolution, once universal, now fractured along spiritual lines. While reformers dismantled privilege, many nobles and royalists fled abroad. Between 1789 and 1791, an estimated 100,000 émigrés left France, including the king's brother, the Comte d'Artois. They settled in border regions and foreign courts, plotting counter-revolution. From Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, these exiles sent letters and manifestos urging monarchs to intervene and restore the old order. The émigré presence fueled suspicion inside France that the revolution was encircled by enemies, within and without. Inside the Tuileries, Louis XVI struggled between resignation and resistance. He publicly accepted constitutional reforms, but privately corresponded with foreign allies. His wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, urged him to flee, believing only outside force could restore his power. The royal family's isolation deepened. Crowds gathered daily outside the palace, chanting slogans. Royal guards were replaced by National Guardsmen loyal to the assembly. Every move the king made was scrutinized. By early 1791, the assembly was drafting the new constitution. It envisioned a constitutional monarchy, balancing royal authority with representative government. Louis would retain executive power, but within the laws passed by the assembly. Yet the king's credibility was crumbling. To the revolutionaries, he was no longer the father of the nation, but a possible conspirator. To conservatives, he was a captive of radicals. In secrecy, the royal family planned an escape. On the night of June 20th, 1791, disguised as servants, they slipped out of the Tuileries and headed northeast toward the frontier, aiming for Montmedy, where loyal troops awaited. However, the plan unraveled. The heavy carriage moved slowly, and the royal likeness was too recognizable. Near the town of Varennes, a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet identified the king from a portrait on a banknote. The alarm was raised, and the fugitives were captured and brought back to Paris on June 22, 1791. The return was silent and grim. Crowds lined the streets in complete silence as the royal carriage passed. The king who once ruled by divine right was now a prisoner of his people. The flight to Varennes shattered the illusion that the king could be trusted to uphold the revolution. His attempted escape confirmed fears of conspiracy. Confidence in the monarchy evaporated. Republican sentiment, once marginal, began to grow. Pamphleteers like Jean-Paul Marat and Camille Desmoulins denounced the king as a traitor. Radical clubs such as the Cordeliers and Jacobins demanded the establishment of a republic. Moderates in the assembly, fearing civil war or foreign intervention, tried to contain the damage. They suspended the king's powers but did not depose him. They insisted the flight was a misunderstanding, that the king had acted under duress. But few believed it. In response to public anger, censorship increased and protests were banned. On July 17, 1791, a demonstration at the Champ de Mars demanding the king's abdication was violently dispersed by the National Guard under Lafayette's command. Dozens were killed. The event exposed deep divisions among the revolutionaries themselves, between those seeking order and those seeking radical change. Despite turmoil, the assembly pressed forward. On September 3, 1791, it adopted the Constitution of 1791, officially transforming France into a constitutional monarchy. It established a single legislative assembly elected by active citizens, men who paid a minimum tax. The king retained the power to veto laws temporarily and appoint ministers. Feudal privileges were abolished. Equality before the law was affirmed. Louis XVI swore an oath to the Constitution on September 14, 1791, restoring a fragile calm. But his acceptance was widely seen as forced. Having completed its task, the National Constituent Assembly dissolved itself on September 30, 1791. The next day, the new Legislative Assembly convened under the Constitution. Yet the mood was uncertain. The revolution had achieved its first great phase. abolition of feudalism, civil equality, a constitution, but it had not achieved unity. Economic hardship persisted, religious conflict deepened, and the monarchy's legitimacy was crippled. The divisions were clear. Moderates sought stability under a limited monarchy. Radicals demanded a republic. Royalists plotted restoration. France, though transformed, stood divided and vulnerable. The events of 1791 had closed one chapter but opened another, one that would soon bring war, terror, and the fall of the monarchy itself. The revolution between 1789 and 1791 represented an extraordinary social reordering. Within 2 years, the old feudal world had been dismantled by decree and uprising. The church was nationalized, hereditary privilege abolished, and sovereignty transferred from the crown to the citizen. Yet the very success of these reforms created instability. The traditional anchors of French life, monarchy, church, and nobility, were broken, but no stable replacement had yet taken hold. France was, for the moment, a constitutional experiment governed by ideals, uncertainty, and hunger. Europe watched closely. Foreign monarchies feared the contagion of revolution spreading across their borders. The émigré nobles agitated abroad, urging intervention. In Paris, radical clubs prepared for confrontation. By the end of 1791, France stood between two futures: constitutional reform or revolutionary escalation. The decision would not come through debate, but through war and insurrection. By 1793, the French Revolution had entered its most turbulent and violent stage. The optimism that once defined the National Assembly's reforms had turned into widespread fear, suspicion, and bloodshed. The war abroad intensified. The monarchy had been overthrown, and internal divisions grew into open conflict. France, surrounded by enemies and torn apart from within, shifted toward radicalization. The period between 1793 and 1794 became known as the Reign of Terror, a time when revolutionary ideals collided with the harsh realities of survival. The trial and execution of King Louis XVI marked the definitive break between revolutionary France and the old regime. After the monarchy was abolished in September 1792, the National Convention placed Louis on trial for treason. Evidence was gathered from seized royal correspondence showing his secret dealings with foreign powers. On January 17, 1793, the convention voted overwhelmingly for his guilt, and by a narrow majority, 361 to 360, for his execution. 4 days later, on January 21, 1793, the king was guillotined in the Place de la Révolution in Paris. His execution shocked Europe. Monarchies across the continent condemned the act, viewing it as a direct threat to the established order. For the revolutionaries, it symbolized the triumph of the Republic over tyranny. Yet it also deepened divisions within France. Royalists vowed revenge, moderate revolutionaries grew uneasy, and radical factions demanded further purges to secure the revolution's survival. France's execution of the king provoked an international crisis. In February 1793, Britain, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and Austria joined Prussia in a coalition against revolutionary France, creating what became known as the First Coalition. The French Republic found itself surrounded by enemies on nearly every frontier. Conscription was reintroduced through the levy en masse, August 23, 1793, requiring all able-bodied men to defend the nation. It marked the first modern example of total war, mobilizing the entire population for defense. Revolutionary armies swelled to over 1 million soldiers, transforming France from a nation on the brink of invasion into a military power. However, early campaigns were chaotic. Shortages of food, weapons, and training plagued the army. Desertion and internal uprisings compounded the crisis. The most significant of these was the Vade Rebellion, March 1793, a royalist and Catholic insurrection in western France. It erupted against conscription and anti-clerical measures, evolving into a brutal civil war that cost over 200,000 lives before being crushed. The National Convention had split into two main factions, the Girondins and the Montagnards. The Girondins represented moderate Republicans who opposed the extreme use of violence and favored a decentralized government. The Montagnards, led by Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat, sat high in the Assembly Chamber, the Mountain, and advocated for radical measures to defend the revolution. As economic instability worsened and foreign armies advanced, the Montagnards accused the Girondins of weakness and betrayal. The radical Parisian populace, mobilized through the sans-culottes, became the decisive force. On June 2, 1793, after days of armed demonstrations, the Girondin leaders were arrested and later executed. Power passed to the Montagnards and the Paris Commune, setting the stage for centralized revolutionary control. In April 1793, before the Girondins' fall, the convention had established the Committee of Public Safety to coordinate the war effort and manage internal security. After June, the committee effectively became the revolutionary government. It was dominated by 12 members, including Robespierre, Saint-Just, Georges Couthon, and Carnot, who organized the army. The committee centralized power and imposed strict control over the economy, the military, and public life. It enforced the law of the maximum, September 1793, setting price limits on essential goods to curb inflation and speculation. The committee also reorganized the army, enforced discipline, and began to reverse earlier military defeats. While the Committee of Public Safety claimed to defend liberty, it relied on coercion and terror. The revolutionary slogan shifted from liberty, equality, fraternity to liberty, equality, or death. To suppress internal enemies, the Revolutionary Tribunal was established in March 1793. It was empowered to try counter-revolutionaries swiftly, often without proper defense or evidence. The Law of Suspects, September 17, 1793, broadened the definition of enemies of the revolution to include nobles, clergy, hoarders, or anyone insufficiently patriotic. Thousands were arrested across France. In Paris, the guillotine became a daily spectacle at the Place de la Révolution. The phrase, "Let terror be the order of the day," first uttered by Bertrand Barrère, captured the grim spirit of the times. Between 1793 and 1794, approximately 16,000 people were executed officially, with tens of thousands more dying in prison or in mass shootings in regions like Lyon and Nantes. The revolution's radical phase also targeted religion. Churches were closed, religious symbols destroyed, and priests forced to renounce their faith. In 1793, a movement known as de-Christianization swept through France. The cult of reason, promoted by radicals like Jacques Hébert, replaced Christianity with a secular civic religion dedicated to liberty and rational thought. Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris was transformed into the Temple of Reason. The Christian calendar was replaced by the French Republican calendar, starting from year I, September 22, 1792, marking the founding of the Republic. These measures alienated many citizens, especially in rural areas, and widened the divide between revolutionary authorities and the general population. By late 1793, Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety held near absolute power. The execution of key revolutionary figures followed swiftly. Marie Antoinette, the former queen, was executed on October 16, 1793. The Girondins, previously imprisoned, were guillotined later that month. Jean-Paul Marat, a radical journalist and Montagnard hero, had already been assassinated by Charlotte Corday in July. The terror intensified in 1794. The Law of 22 Prairial, June 1794, further simplified trials, allowing the tribunal to convict without witnesses or defense. Executions accelerated dramatically. Historians estimate 40 to 50 people were guillotined daily in Paris at its height. Robespierre justified the terror as necessary. Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. Under his leadership, the committee viewed virtue and terror as inseparable tools to preserve the Republic. By early 1794, divisions re-emerged within the revolutionary leadership. The Hébertists, followers of Jacques Hébert, called for even greater radicalism and mass executions. The Dantonists, led by Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins, argued for moderation and an end to bloodshed. Robespierre saw both groups as threats. The Hébertists were executed in March 1794, followed by the Dantonists in April 1794. Their deaths eliminated opposition within the revolutionary government, but it also left Robespierre isolated and feared. By mid-1794, the war situation had improved. French armies had pushed back foreign invaders and secured victories at Fleurus, June 26, 1794. With external threats receding, the justification for terror weakened. Yet Robespierre continued purges, even targeting members of the convention and the committee itself. His increasing authoritarianism and moral rigidity turned allies into enemies. On July 27, 1794, 9 Thermidor, year 2, Robespierre and his closest supporters were arrested during a session of the convention. The next day, they were executed without trial. With his death, the reign of terror officially ended. Over 16,000 executions had been carried out by the tribunal, and an estimated 300,000 citizens had been imprisoned. The Thermidorian reaction that followed dismantled the machinery of terror. The Committee of Public Safety lost its powers, and the revolutionary fervor subsided. A new constitution was drafted, leading to the establishment of the Directory in 1795. Though the terror had preserved the Republic in its darkest hour, it left a divided legacy. It demonstrated the extremes of revolutionary zeal and the dangers of absolute power. By 1794, France had survived foreign invasion and internal rebellion, but at a staggering human cost. The fall of Maximilien Robespierre on July 27, 1794, 9 Thermidor, year 2, marked a turning point in the French Revolution. The machinery of terror that had defined the previous year began to collapse under its own weight. What followed was a period of political retaliation, disillusionment, and social chaos, known as the Thermidorian reaction. This phase saw the decline of the Jacobins, the rise of new power blocks, and the painful transition from revolutionary radicalism toward moderation and eventual instability. Robespierre's downfall was swift and brutal. After his arrest, he and 21 of his closest allies, including Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just and Georges Couthon, were executed by guillotine the next day, July 28, 1794, 10 Thermidor. His death ended the reign of terror but left a political vacuum. In the hours following his execution, crowds that once cheered the guillotine began dismantling the Place de la Révolution, where thousands had died. The Jacobin Club, once the nerve center of revolutionary radicalism, lost influence as moderates and survivors of the terror began to reassert control. The National Convention quickly moved to undo the structures Robespierre had built. The Committee of Public Safety was stripped of its dictatorial powers, and many of the revolutionary tribunals were dissolved. The same deputies who had once supported Robespierre now denounced him as a tyrant who had betrayed the revolution. The Thermidorian reaction, July 1794 to 1795, represented both relief and reckoning. It began as an attempt to restore legality and end arbitrary rule, but it soon evolved into revenge against the radicals who had dominated the terror. Revolutionary institutions such as the Committee of General Security and the Committee of Public Safety were reorganized to prevent the concentration of power. Many local revolutionary committees were disbanded. The Law of 22 Prairial, which had enabled mass executions without defense or witnesses, was repealed. Prisoners accused under the law of suspects were released, and a general atmosphere of retribution emerged. Those who had enforced the terror were now labeled as terrorists. Some faced lynchings, others were executed in turn. This counter-movement didn't restore peace. It simply reversed the polarity of fear. The revolution had entered a new cycle. Terror against radicals replaced terror against royalists. The Thermidorian period gave rise to what historians call the White Terror, a wave of counter-revolutionary violence led by royalists and moderates against former Jacobins, sans-culottes, and Montagnards. In the provinces, particularly in Lyon, Marseille, and Toulon, gangs known as Jeunesse Dorée, Gilded Youth, attacked and murdered former revolutionaries. Many wore extravagant clothing and carried canes as symbols of defiance against the austerity of the terror years. Hundreds of local Jacobin officials were killed without trial. The government, though uneasy, often tolerated or ignored the reprisals, as it benefited from the weakening of radical elements. The prisons that had once held enemies of the revolution were now filled with Jacobins awaiting retribution. The Jacobin Club in Paris was finally shut down in November 1794 after moderates accused it of inciting unrest. This closure symbolized the end of the radical revolutionary movement that had once dominated France's political life. While political purges continued, the French population suffered deeply from the ongoing economic collapse. The assignats, the paper currency issued during the Revolution, lost nearly all value due to overprinting and lack of confidence. By early 1795, rampant inflation made basic goods unaffordable. Food shortages returned with severity. Poor harvests, hoarding, and the breakdown of trade networks caused bread prices to soar. The sans-culottes, once the revolution's driving force, now faced starvation. The same government they had helped bring to power was unresponsive to their plight. The law of the maximum, which had set price controls, was repealed in December 1794. This allowed merchants to raise prices freely, worsening the crisis for the urban poor. Riots broke out in Paris as workers demanded bread and the Constitution of 1793. In April 1795, the insurrection of 12 Germinal, Year 3, erupted when thousands of Parisians stormed the convention demanding food and the restoration of radical policies. The uprising was quickly suppressed, and leaders were arrested. Another revolt, the insurrection of 1 Prairial, May 20th, 1795, followed, but it too failed. After Prairial, the revolutionary left was crushed completely. The sans-culottes' political influence vanished. The Thermidorian period also witnessed the deaths of several prominent revolutionaries, further signaling the end of the radical era. Jean-Baptiste Carrier, notorious for his atrocities during the Vade campaign, was executed in December 1794. Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, the former public prosecutor of the Revolutionary Tribunal, met the same fate in May 1795. Joseph Fouché, another enforcer of the terror, narrowly escaped execution and would later return to power under Napoleon. By mid-1795, the leadership of the revolution had shifted from radical idealists to pragmatic politicians and military men. The revolutionary dream of a virtuous republic had given way to the politics of survival. As France sought stability, the National Convention drafted a new constitution to replace the authoritarian framework of the terror. Completed in August 1795, the Constitution of Year 3 established the Directory, a new form of government designed to prevent the concentration of power in any single body or leader. Key features of the Constitution included a bicameral legislature, the Council of 500 Lower House, and the Council of Ancients Upper House, an executive branch composed of 5 directors elected by the legislature, a system that favored property owners, with voting rights limited to male citizens who paid taxes, excluding the poorer classes who had driven much of the revolution. The Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man and Citizen replaced the earlier Declaration of 1789, emphasizing duty and order over radical liberty. This new constitution was approved by a plebiscite and went into effect on October 26, 1795, for Brumaire, Year 4. It marked the formal end of the National Convention and the radical phase of the revolution. Despite internal instability, France's military situation improved considerably after 1794. Victories at Fleurus, Tourcoing, and Wattignies pushed enemy forces back. By 1795, France had occupied the Austrian Netherlands, modern Belgium, the Rhineland, and much of northern Italy. Peace treaties began to emerge. Prussia signed the Treaty of Basel in April 1795, withdrawing from the First Coalition. Spain followed in July with another Treaty of Basel, leaving Britain and Austria as France's main enemies. These diplomatic successes strengthened France's position in Europe even as its domestic politics unraveled. While the revolution had executed Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, royalist hopes still centered on their surviving son, Louis Charles, titled Louis XVII by royalists. Imprisoned since 1792, he died in captivity on June 8, 1795, likely from illness and neglect. His death extinguished the last direct Bourbon heir of Louis XVI's line, though royalists soon transferred their loyalty to Louis XVIII, the king's brother, in exile. Royalist uprisings continued to threaten the Republic. The most notable was the Vendémiaire uprising on October 5, 1795, 13 Vendémiaire, Year 4, when royalist insurgents marched on Paris. The revolt was crushed by General Napoleon Bonaparte, who commanded the artillery and famously used a whiff of grape shot to scatter the mob. This event marked Bonaparte's first major political appearance and earned him national fame. By the end of 1795, France's social fabric had transformed. The austere moralism of Robespierre's era gave way to indulgence and luxury. The reactionary style emerged, a wave of fashion, music, and art that rejected revolutionary austerity. Aristocratic habits reappeared, and Paris's salons reopened. However, this revival coexisted with deep inequality and disillusionment. The revolutionary promise of equality had faded into cynicism. The new ruling class, wealthy merchants, officials, and army contractors, replaced the old nobility but behaved much the same. When the Constitution of Year 3 took effect on October 26, 1795, for Brumaire Year 4, France entered a new phase of the revolution. The era of the Directory began, an experiment in moderate republicanism born out of exhaustion. After years of terror and purges, the new regime promised stability without tyranny, but it would instead reveal how fragile post-revolutionary France had become. The National Convention dissolved itself, handing power to the newly created bicameral legislature. The Council of 500 proposed laws, while the Council of Ancients, 250 members over 40 years old, approved or rejected them. Executive authority rested in a five-man directory, intended to prevent another dictatorship like Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety. The first directors were Paul Barras, Louis-Marie de la Revillière-Lepeau, Jean-François Rioubel, Étienne-François Latourneur, and Lazare Carnot. Barras, a survivor of the revolution's extremes and a master political opportunist, quickly became its most influential figure. The Constitution deliberately curtailed popular participation. Voting was restricted to property-owning males who paid taxes, roughly 1 in 30 citizens. The radical urban poor, the sans-culottes, were excluded. The new regime was designed to protect property and curb both Jacobin radicalism and royalist restoration. From its first day, the Directory inherited a near-ruined state. France was still at war with Britain and Austria, its treasury empty, and its economy shattered. Inflation had made the assignat practically worthless. The nation was weary of ideological battles, but still divided along class, regional, and political lines. The government attempted financial reforms, including introducing a new currency, the mandat territorial, in early 1796. It failed almost instantly, leading to barter economies and rampant speculation. Corruption spread through every level of administration. Directors, deputies, and army suppliers enriched themselves while citizens struggled for bread. This mix of economic failure, political corruption, and social disillusionment would define the Directory's short life. The Directory stood between two hostile forces: Royalists, who wanted the Bourbons restored, and Jacobins, who sought a return to the egalitarian constitution of 1793. Royalists found strength in Western France, particularly the Vade, still smoldering after years of civil war. In October 1795, a royalist uprising erupted in Paris. The 13 Vendémiaire Revolt, led by monarchist factions opposing the Convention's new constitution. The insurrection was crushed by artillery under General Napoleon Bonaparte, who famously dispersed the mob with a whiff of grape shot. His decisive action saved the convention and earned him command of the Army of the Interior. Although defeated, royalism remained a persistent danger. Many émigrés and nobles abroad formed networks of intrigue, backed by Britain. Secret royalist committees operated in Paris, waiting for an opportunity to strike. On the opposite end, former Jacobins and sans-culottes, marginalized by the new constitution, plotted sporadic uprisings. The Babeuf conspiracy, led by Gracchus Babeuf in 1796, became the most notable. Advocating common ownership of land and equality of wealth, Babeuf's conspiracy of the equals was an early form of communist thought. The Directory infiltrated and dismantled it. Babeuf and his ally Augustin Darthe were executed in 1797. The repression that followed silenced radical voices, consolidating the Directory's middle-class base. With politics unstable and the economy collapsing, the Directory relied increasingly on the army to maintain order and fund itself. Soldiers were paid irregularly, but victory abroad brought plunder and prestige. France fielded several armies along different fronts: the Army of the Rhine, the Army of Italy, and the Army of the North. By 1796, attention shifted to Italy, where Austria's allies, Piedmont and Sardinia, posed threats. The government appointed Napoleon Bonaparte, then 26 years old, to command the Army of Italy in March 1796. Napoleon's campaign transformed France's fortunes. His forces defeated the Austrians and their allies in a string of battles. Montagnat, April 12, 1796, Lodi, May 10, Arcole, 15 to 17 November, and Rivoli, January 14, 1797. Within a year, he conquered northern Italy, forcing Austria to negotiate. These victories had two consequences. First, they restored France's international standing and brought enormous wealth through requisitions and indemnities. Second, they elevated Napoleon as a national hero. His military dispatches, published widely, painted him as the savior of the revolution. The Directory, meanwhile, appeared weak and dependent on his success. The Italian triumphs culminated in the Treaty of Campo Formio on October 17, 1797, between France and Austria. The treaty redrew Europe's map. Austria recognized French control over Belgium and the left bank of the Rhine, while Venice was ceded to Austria in exchange. Italy was reorganized into sister republics, the Cisalpine and Ligurian republics, governed on French revolutionary principles. French armies now spread republican institutions across Europe, abolishing feudal privileges, introducing civil codes, and secularizing church property. Yet the expansion also carried contradictions. Many conquered regions viewed French rule as exploitation rather than liberation. Back in Paris, the directors celebrated victories but grew wary of Napoleon's growing influence. His army's loyalty to him personally, not the government, foreshadowed a dangerous imbalance between civil authority and military power. As military glory rose abroad, Corruption deepened at home. Speculators and contractors enriched themselves through army supplies. Directors and deputies accumulated fortunes while the common people endured scarcity. Political life became cynical. Bribes, patronage, and intrigue replaced revolutionary zeal. The jeunesse dorée, the fashionable elite who had opposed the Jacobins, flaunted luxury in Parisian salons, signaling a cultural swing away from austerity. Society is split between those profiting from the revolution's chaos and those crushed beneath it. The press, though freer than under the terror, became a weapon of factional warfare. Dozens of short-lived newspapers attacked the government or one another, reflecting the volatility of public opinion. By 1797, Royalists had regained strength through the ballot box. In the legislative elections of April 1797, they won significant seats, threatening to overturn the Republic from within. Two directors, Carnot and Barthélemy, leaned toward conciliation with monarchists, while Barras and his allies plotted to preserve the Republic by force. On September 4, 1797, 18 Fructidor Year v. Troops loyal to Barras and commanded by General Augereau surrounded Paris. They arrested leading royalist deputies, annulled the recent elections, and deported dozens to Guyana without trial. The coup re-established control by pro-republican forces but destroyed the pretense of constitutional legality. After Fructidor, the Directory governed more like a military junta than a republic. Civil rights were curtailed, the press censored again, and thousands of suspected royalists were exiled. The balance between liberty and order tilted decisively toward repression. Despite victories abroad, daily life in France remained harsh. Grain shortages continued, and prices fluctuated wildly. The failure of the Mandat Territorial drove the economy back to metallic currency, but deflation caused unemployment and credit collapse. War taxes grew heavier, and conscription remained unpopular. Urban workers lost faith in the revolution that had promised them equality. In rural areas, peasants resisted tax collectors and requisitions. The gulf between Paris and the provinces widened. The directors themselves, Barras in particular, lived in opulence, holding lavish receptions in contrast to the population's misery. Such hypocrisy fueled disgust and rumors of conspiracy. The Directory promoted a vision of moderation called the politics of balance, meant to guard against the extremism of either side. In practice, it produced paralysis. Factions plotted constantly, and shifting alliances made coherent governance impossible. Elections were frequently overturned, censorship reimposed, and public assemblies banned. The Council of 500 debated endlessly but accomplished little. The executive relied on emergency decrees and military enforcement. At the same time, art and education began to serve patriotic purposes. The École Polytechnique and the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers were established to train citizens in science and industry, reflecting the revolution's rationalist legacy even amid political decay. While domestic politics crumbled, France's armies extended their influence further. In Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Germany, new republics modeled on the French system emerged. These sister republics exported revolutionary law but also drained resources to feed France's wars. The Directory viewed expansion as both an ideological mission and an economic necessity. War indemnities financed the bankrupt state. Plunder kept soldiers loyal. Peace meant financial ruin. So the wars continued almost by default. This cycle made generals indispensable. Their growing prestige, especially that of Napoleon Bonaparte, would soon overshadow civilian government altogether. By 1796, the French Revolution had reached a point of exhaustion. A decade of upheaval, war, and economic hardship had left the Republic politically fragile and socially divided. The Directory faced growing disillusionment among the French people, while royalists and radical Jacobins both conspired against it. In this volatile context, one man began to emerge as the Republic's most decisive figure: Napoleon Bonaparte. His rise from relative obscurity to national prominence would redefine not only France's future, but also the course of European history. Born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica, Napoleon came from a modest family of minor Italian nobility. His military education in France, particularly at Brienne and the École Militaire in Paris, revealed his exceptional aptitude for mathematics, strategy, and command. By the outbreak of the Revolution, he was already serving as a young artillery officer in the French army. Like many ambitious officers, Napoleon's rise accelerated due to the Revolution's sweeping reorganization of military ranks, which allowed talent to outshine birthright. His first significant breakthrough came in 1793 during the Siege of Toulon, when he recaptured the port city from royalist forces supported by the British. For this victory, he was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. Yet it was in 1796, when the Directory appointed him commander of the Army of Italy, that his strategic genius and political instinct became undeniable. When Napoleon took command, the Army of Italy was poorly equipped, demoralized, and underfed. His first task was to instill discipline and confidence. He promised his soldiers both glory and wealth, declaring, "You are naked, ill-fed, but rich in courage. I will lead you to the most fertile plains in the world." What followed was one of the most brilliant military campaigns in modern history. Within weeks, Napoleon reorganized his forces, exploiting the geographic and political weaknesses of his enemies, primarily Austria and its Italian allies, including the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont. In a series of rapid and decisive battles, Montagnat, April 12, 1796, Millesimo Dago, and Mondovi, Napoleon forced Piedmont to sign the Armistice of Cherasco on April 28, 1796, removing one of Austria's key allies from the war. He then turned his attention to Austria's main army under Beaulieu and Wurmser. Through audacious maneuvers and psychological warfare, Napoleon isolated and defeated enemy forces one by one. The victories at Lodi, May 10th, Castiglione, August 5th, and Arcole, November 15th to 17th, demonstrated his mastery of mobility and deception. His triumph at Rivoli, January 14th to 15th, 1797, crushed Austria's final attempt to regain northern Italy. By April 1797, his armies had reached within 100 kilometers of Vienna. Napoleon's success was not purely military. He also used propaganda to shape his image as a revolutionary hero. His dispatches, printed in French newspapers, turned him into a household name. To his soldiers, he was a symbol of victory. To the public, a savior who restored French pride. To the Directory, both an asset and a growing threat. While Napoleon achieved victory abroad, the Directory continued to falter at home. Corruption, economic instability, and political infighting eroded its authority. Inflation remained high. The assignats, paper money, had collapsed in value, and food shortages persisted in several regions. Two main factions battled within the Directory's political framework: the Jacobins, who wanted a return to radical republicanism and social equality; the Royalists, who sought to restore the monarchy under Louis XVIII. Napoleon's victories provided the Directory with temporary legitimacy, but also highlighted its dependency on military success. He was not only winning battles, but also negotiating treaties, collecting taxes from conquered territories, and redrawing the political map of Europe, powers usually reserved for statesmen, not generals. His creation of sister republics in Italy, such as the Cisalpine Republic and Ligurian Republic, reflected revolutionary principles, but also expanded French influence. He plundered immense wealth, sending art, gold, and resources back to Paris, stabilizing the French economy temporarily and funding the Directory's government. The climax of Napoleon's Italian campaign came with the Treaty of Campo Formio, signed on October 17, 1797, between France and Austria. The treaty was a major diplomatic victory for France, marking the end of the War of the First Coalition, 1792 to 1797. Its terms reshaped Europe's borders. France gained recognition of its annexation of Belgium, the Austrian Netherlands. Austria ceded Lombardy and the Austrian possessions in northern Italy to France. The Cisalpine Republic was established as a French client state. Austria received Venetia and parts of the Dalmatian coast, compensating for its Italian losses. This treaty, largely negotiated by Napoleon himself, elevated him from general to statesman. His autonomy during negotiations unsettled the Directory, which realized that his personal popularity and military success had begun to eclipse its own authority. Still, the government celebrated the treaty as a triumph for revolutionary France, even as it sowed the seeds of its own decline. By the end of 1797, Napoleon had become the dominant figure of the revolution's later years. His ability to inspire troops, deliver victory, and manage propaganda made him a national icon. His correspondence with the Directory was respectful yet subtly dismissive, revealing his growing confidence in his destiny. Parisian society began to idolize him. Newspapers described him as the man of destiny, a leader capable of restoring stability and glory to France. The public's faith in the Republic's civilian government weakened as admiration for the military commander grew. Napoleon's marriage to Josephine de Beauharnais in March 1796 had also strengthened his social position. Josephine's connections within Paris's political elite gave him valuable allies, though their relationship was often strained by his absences and her rumored infidelities. Still, the union symbolized Napoleon's merging of revolutionary energy with aristocratic ambition. While Napoleon was consolidating his fame, the Directory struggled to suppress opposition at home. The Royalist resurgence in the legislative elections of 1797 alarmed the directors, leading to the coup of 18 Fructidor, September 4, 1797. Backed by the army and key generals like Hoche and Augereau, the Directory annulled election results, purged Royalist deputies, and arrested opponents. This coup marked the increasing militarization of French politics, a pattern that Napoleon would later exploit. The government now depended heavily on loyal generals to maintain control, further blurring the line between civilian and military authority. By the close of 1797, Napoleon returned to Paris as the nation's most celebrated hero. He had transformed France's fortunes abroad, restored its prestige, and brought immense wealth through plunder and treaties. Yet his success also revealed the Directory's weakness and the Republic's growing dependence on military power. The French people, weary of political chaos, began to look beyond the ideals of liberty and equality. They sought stability, order, and leadership, qualities Napoleon seemed to embody. His next step, the Egyptian campaign, 1798 to 1799, would extend his legend and bring him closer to absolute power. By 1798, the French Directory stood in a precarious position. It had survived the Thermidorian backlash, royalist conspiracies, and radical uprisings, but its legitimacy remained weak. France's victories under Napoleon Bonaparte had brought glory and wealth, yet they also exposed the Directory's dependence on military power. Napoleon had become a national hero, celebrated by the people, feared by politicians. To the Directory, he was both an asset and a potential threat. Sending him far from Paris seemed the safest way to control him. Napoleon's proposed expedition to Egypt served multiple purposes. Officially, it was meant to strike at Britain's access to its prized colony, India, by disrupting the trade routes through the Red Sea. Unofficially, it was also a calculated attempt to expand French influence in the East and to carve out an empire of his own making. The Directory approved the plan, seeing it as a way to sideline Napoleon while continuing to project French power abroad. The Egyptian campaign was unlike any previous French military expedition. It was part conquest, part scientific enterprise. Alongside the Army of the Orient, which numbered around 35,000 men, Napoleon brought with him a team of over 160 scholars, engineers, artists, and scientists known as the Commission des Sciences et des Arts. Their mission was to study Egypt's culture, history, geography, and natural resources, a pursuit that would later lead to the monumental Description de l'Égypte, one of the greatest scholarly works of the 19th century. This blend of military ambition and intellectual exploration gave the campaign an air of grandeur and progressivism. Napoleon framed it as a mission to liberate Egypt from Mamluk rule, introduce enlightened government, and spread revolutionary ideals. However, beneath this rhetoric lay clear imperial motives: control the eastern Mediterranean and challenge British dominance. The fleet departed Toulon on May 19, 1798, under the protection of Admiral Brueys. On its way to Egypt, it captured the strategic island of Malta from the Knights of St. John on June 9, 1798. Napoleon reorganized the island's government, abolished feudal privileges, and introduced new reforms before continuing toward Africa. This brief conquest showcased his efficiency and ideological consistency, exporting French revolutionary principles wherever his armies marched. By July 1, 1798, the French fleet landed near Alexandria, taking the city with minimal resistance. From there, Napoleon advanced toward Cairo, determined to defeat the Mamluks, the military aristocracy that ruled Egypt under nominal Ottoman suzerainty. The defining engagement of the campaign came at Mbaba, near the Giza Plateau. On July 21, 1798, Napoleon's forces faced the formidable cavalry of Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey, leaders of the Mamluks. Though the Mamluks were renowned horsemen, their outdated tactics and reliance on direct cavalry charges proved disastrous against the French's disciplined infantry squares and modern artillery. Napoleon addressed his troops before the battle. "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." Whether he truly uttered these words is debated, but the phrase became symbolic of his grand vision, aligning himself with history's great conquerors. The Battle of the Pyramids ended in a decisive French victory. The Mamluk army was crushed, Cairo was taken, and Napoleon entered the city as its master. To the local population, he presented himself as a liberator rather than an invader. He proclaimed respect for Islam, wore traditional robes during public appearances, and even attended local ceremonies to win over Egyptian religious leaders. Yet Napoleon's triumph on land was quickly overshadowed by disaster at sea. On August 1st, 1798, the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson located and attacked the French navy anchored in Abu Qir Bay. The ensuing Battle of the Nile was one of the most devastating naval defeats in French history. Nelson's tactical brilliance trapped the French ships between two lines of British fire, annihilating the fleet. Out of 13 French ships of the line, 11 were destroyed or captured. Admiral Brueys was killed when his flagship, the Orient, exploded in a fiery blast visible from miles away. Napoleon's army was stranded, cut off from France, isolated in a hostile land. The news of the defeat spread rapidly across Europe, galvanizing Britain, Austria, and Russia to form the Second Coalition against France. Napoleon's expedition, intended to weaken Britain, had instead strengthened the alliance opposing him. With no route home, Napoleon turned his attention to governing Egypt. He established the Institut d'Égypte in Cairo, bringing together scientists and scholars to study and modernize Egyptian society. They conducted pioneering research in engineering, medicine, agriculture, and linguistics. During this period, one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in history occurred: the Rosetta Stone, found near Rashid in July 1799, which would later unlock the secret of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Despite his efforts to stabilize the region, Napoleon faced deep cultural and religious resistance. His attempts to impose new taxes and administrative reforms sparked resentment. On October 21st, 1798, Cairo erupted in a violent revolt. The insurgents attacked French troops and officials, shouting religious slogans against the occupiers. Napoleon responded with brutal force. After 2 days of heavy fighting, the rebellion was crushed and hundreds were executed. Though the uprising was quelled, it revealed the limits of his control and the fragility of his claim to be a liberator. Seeking to expand his influence and preempt an Ottoman counterattack, Napoleon launched an invasion of Syria in February 1799. His army advanced through Palestine, capturing El Arish, Gaza, and Jaffa. However, his troops suffered from disease, exhaustion, and fierce resistance. At Jaffa, Napoleon ordered the execution of roughly 4,000 prisoners of war, an act that remains one of the most controversial episodes of his career. The campaign reached its climax at the Siege of Acre, May 1799. Despite repeated assaults, the city, defended by Ottoman forces under Ahmad Pasha al-Jazir and supported by British naval artillery commanded by Sir Sidney Smith, held firm. After 2 months of heavy fighting and mounting casualties, Napoleon was forced to retreat on May 20th, 1799. His withdrawal from Syria marked the beginning of the end of the Egyptian expedition. Disease ravaged his troops, supplies dwindled, morale collapsed. Still, Napoleon crafted a narrative of partial victory, claiming he had repelled the Ottomans and secured Egypt. Back in Egypt, Napoleon received news that France was once again under threat from the Second Coalition, Britain, Austria, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, and that the Directory was in crisis. Realizing the opportunity that political chaos presented, he decided to abandon his army and return home. On August 23, 1799, Napoleon secretly boarded the frigate Muiron and sailed back to France, leaving his troops under the command of General Jean-Baptiste Kleber. The journey was perilous, with the Mediterranean still patrolled by the British Navy, but he reached Frejus safely on October 9, 1799. Upon his arrival, he was greeted not as a failed commander, but as a national hero. French propaganda had already transformed his Egyptian venture into a tale of courage, science, and discovery. The failures, the naval defeat, the uprisings, the retreat from Acre were downplayed. What remained in the public mind was the image of a leader who dared to confront empires and civilizations far from Europe's borders. The Egyptian campaign of 1798 to 1799 was both a military failure and a strategic turning point. It exposed the overreach of revolutionary France, but also marked the beginning of Napoleon's global vision. The expedition combined conquest with intellectual ambition, producing a fusion of Enlightenment inquiry and imperial ambition. The campaign also had long-lasting effects. It opened Western eyes to the depth of Egyptian civilization. It inspired the modern field of Egyptology. It weakened Ottoman authority in the region. And it cemented Napoleon's reputation as the man destined to lead France out of its revolutionary chaos. When he returned to France, the Directory was collapsing under military defeats and public discontent. The revolution, after 10 turbulent years, was ready for a new phase, one that would end its Republican experiment and usher in the Napoleonic era. By the autumn of 1799, France was exhausted. 10 years of revolution had left the country drained by war, inflation, political violence, and disillusionment. The Directory, formed in 1795 to stabilize the Republic, had become synonymous with corruption and weakness. The army remained loyal but unpaid. Bread was scarce. Trust in government was almost non-existent, and royalist sentiment quietly re-emerged in the countryside. The Directory's internal divisions made decisive leadership impossible. Two of its directors, Paul Barras and Abbé Sieyès, understood that the regime could not survive another year. Sieyès, a former revolutionary and intellectual, was famous for his 1789 pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? Had re-entered politics in 1799 with a clear objective: to replace the failed republican structure with a more efficient, authoritarian system. What he lacked was a military figure strong enough to execute it. That figure arrived in October 1799, when Napoleon Bonaparte returned unexpectedly from Egypt. When Napoleon landed at Frejus on October 9, 1799, he found a nation weary of chaos and yearning for stability. Though the Egyptian campaign had ended in strategic failure, news of his return was greeted with jubilation. The French public saw him as the hero who had humbled Austria and Italy, the embodiment of national strength and discipline. Napoleon wasted no time reasserting his political influence. By the time he reached Paris on October 16, 1799, he was already plotting with size. And Pierre-Roger Ducasse, another director sympathetic to reform. They agreed that a coup d'état was necessary to overthrow the Directory and install a new executive power. Size envisioned a system in which authority would be centralized but disguised under Republican forms. His ideal figurehead was a strong leader, one who could command the army and inspire obedience. Napoleon fit that role perfectly. To prepare the coup, the conspirators needed to ensure the cooperation of the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500, the two legislative bodies established by the Constitution of Year 3. Size and Ducasse planned to persuade these councils that an imminent Jacobin uprising in Paris required their relocation to St. Cloud, a suburb west of the capital. There, under the watch of loyal troops, the coup could unfold with minimal resistance. On the morning of November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire, Year 8, the coup began. The Council of Ancients, swayed by Size's fabricated warning of a Jacobin plot, voted to move both chambers of the legislature to St. Cloud. They also appointed Napoleon Bonaparte commander of all troops in Paris, giving him legal control of the military within the city. By midday, Napoleon's soldiers surrounded key government buildings, including the Tuileries Palace, the Luxembourg Palace, and the Ministry of Police. The remaining directors were confronted with the reality of force. 2. Gohier and Moulin refused to resign and were arrested. The others, Barras, Size, and Ducasse, formally stepped down, leaving no legal executive authority in place. The Directory had effectively ceased to exist. Napoleon addressed the Council of Ancients later that day, justifying his actions as a patriotic intervention. Citizens, the Republic was perishing. You have summoned me to save it. I will fulfill your wishes. Many accepted this reasoning, preferring the promise of order over another spiral of instability. But the following day would prove more volatile. On 19 Brumaire, the Council of 500 convened in the Orangery of St. Cloud. The atmosphere was tense from the start. When Napoleon entered the chamber, uninvited, to address the deputies, he was met with shouts of "Down with the dictator" and "Outlaw him." His speech was clumsy and defensive. Unaccustomed to legislative procedure, he struggled to justify the coup in Republican language. As deputies pressed forward angrily, General Joachim Murat entered with grenadiers to restore order. The soldiers forcibly cleared the hall, effectively dissolving the assembly by force. The coup, initially framed as constitutional, now rested openly on military power. That evening, a small group of compliant legislators reconvened under army protection. They passed a decree abolishing the Directory and appointing Napoleon Bonaparte, Abbé Size, and Pierre-Roger Ducasse as provisional consuls to draft a new constitution. The coup of 18 to 19 Brumaire was over. The revolution, which had begun 10 years earlier with cries for liberty, equality, and fraternity, had now ended in the hands of a general backed by soldiers. Napoleon quickly sidelined Size and took personal control of the new political order. Over the next few weeks, he and his allies, including Emmanuel Joseph Size, Lucien Bonaparte, and Cambyses, crafted a constitution that consolidated power in the hands of the executive. The Constitution of Year 8, enacted on December 13, 1799, established the consulate. It created 3 consuls, but in reality, only the first consul, Napoleon, wielded real authority. The other 2 consuls, Cambyses and Lebrun, served as advisors. Legislative bodies remained, but their power was hollow, All royal initiatives stemmed from the executive. Napoleon now controlled the army, appointed ministers, proposed laws, and directed foreign policy. The Republic survived in name only. The Revolution's Republican experiment was over, replaced by a centralized, authoritarian state that preserved its rhetoric but not its principles. The French public, weary from a decade of upheaval, largely accepted the new regime. Many saw in Napoleon a man who could restore peace, enforce law, and defend France's interests abroad. To the middle classes, his promise of stability and protection of property was enough. Napoleon's image as a disciplined soldier and pragmatic reformer contrasted sharply with the corruption of the Directory. He declared that the revolution was fixed on its original principles, positioning himself as the guardian of its achievements rather than its betrayer. In the months that followed, France began to transition from revolutionary chaos to centralized order. Administrative reforms resumed. Roads and finances were stabilized. The army regained morale. The country that had once executed its king now rallied behind a new kind of monarch, one who claimed legitimacy not by birth, but by merit and force. Historians widely regard the coup of 18 Brumaire as the formal end of the French Revolution. It closed the chapter that began with the Estates General in 1789 and replaced popular sovereignty with personal rule. In the 10 years between 1789 and 1799, France had dismantled the monarchy, redefined citizenship, and endured internal and external wars that reshaped Europe. Yet the ideals of liberty and equality that fueled the revolution had now been subsumed under a new political reality, one built on order, discipline, and control. The revolution did not end in restoration, as its enemies had hoped, nor in anarchy, as its critics feared. It ended in consolidation, the concentration of power under a single leader whose rule would redefine Europe for the next 15 years. On December 25, 1799, the new government was formally inaugurated in Paris. The consulate was born. Napoleon Bonaparte, now first consul of France, stood at the threshold of an empire that would soon bear his name. The decade between 1789 and 1799 reshaped not only France, but the entire foundation of modern politics, society, and governance. The French Revolution destroyed centuries of monarchy, feudal privilege, and clerical power, replacing them with ideas that would echo through every subsequent era: liberty, equality, and the sovereignty of the people. Its legacy is not simple triumph or failure, but a complex transformation that permanently altered how nations understood power and rights. Before 1789, France was structured under the Ancien Regime, a rigid hierarchy rooted in birth, privilege, and divine right. The revolution dismantled this order piece by piece. The August decrees of 1789 abolished feudal dues, seigneurial rights, and tax exemptions that had shielded the nobility and clergy for generations. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen codified new principles of civil equality and individual liberty, declaring that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. By the early 1790s, the revolution had ended the monarchy, nationalized church property, and erased the privileges of the aristocracy. Nobles who once dominated the provinces were exiled or executed. Their estates became public property. The church, stripped of its temporal authority, was transformed into a civic institution under the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, 1790. These acts broke the fusion of church, crown, and nobility that had defined France for 1,000 years. In this sense, the revolution completed what earlier reform movements and Enlightenment thinkers had only theorized. The medieval world order was finished. France had transitioned, through chaos and blood, from a society of status to one of citizens. The revolution also created a new political language and institutional framework that became the model for modern nation-states. It introduced the concept of citizenship tied to civic duty and rights rather than birth. For the first time, sovereignty was explicitly grounded in the nation, not the monarch. Administrative centralization was another major legacy. To replace the old patchwork of provinces, feudal courts, and local privileges, the revolution reorganized France into 83 departments of roughly equal size, a structure that still exists today. This rationalized system of governance created a unified bureaucracy where local officials were accountable to the central government rather than hereditary lords. The metric system, introduced in 1795, symbolized this drive toward rationality and equality. It replaced inconsistent local measures with a universal standard based on reason and science. Even small reforms like this carried deep ideological weight, the belief that order could emerge from logic, not lineage. The revolution fundamentally redefined the relationship between the individual and the state. It introduced civil equality, secular authority, and the idea that laws should apply equally to all citizens. In doing so, it laid the groundwork for modern legal codes, later perfected under Napoleon as the Civil Code of 1804, which carried revolutionary principles into lasting institutional form. Revolutionary reforms also secularized education. Schools once dominated by the church were gradually replaced by state institutions emphasizing civic virtue and scientific reasoning. While uneven in practice, this shift marked the beginning of public education as a national duty, not a clerical privilege. The revolution's attack on hereditary privilege also expanded opportunity for the emerging bourgeoisie, the middle class of merchants, professionals, and officials. While equality did not extend to the working poor or to women, it established merit and property as the new foundations of social mobility. The revolution's relationship with religion was turbulent but historically decisive. By nationalizing church property, abolishing monastic orders, and subjecting clergy to state control, the revolution ended the Catholic Church's dominance in French political life. Religious toleration was extended to Protestants and Jews, groups that had long faced discrimination. However, radical phases of the revolution, especially the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 1794, went further, attempting to replace Christianity altogether with the cult of reason and later the cult of the Supreme Being. These efforts ultimately failed, but they demonstrated how revolutionary ideology sought to substitute rationalism for faith. The post-terror settlement under the Directory, 1795 to 1799, and later Napoleon's Concordat with the Pope, 1801, did not restore the Church's old power. Instead, they formalized a new balance. Religion would be tolerated but subordinate to the state. This separation between civil and ecclesiastical authority became a defining feature of modern French governance. Economically, the revolution unleashed vast social change. The confiscation and sale of church and émigré lands redistributed property on an unprecedented scale. Millions of peasants acquired small farms, transforming the countryside into a nation of landowners. This shift reduced rural dependence on aristocratic landlords and helped stabilize French agriculture in the long term. The revolution's fiscal reforms, including the abolition of the taille, gabelle, and corvée, eliminated some of the most hated taxes and labor obligations of the Ancien regime. Although the Revolutionary Wars brought economic hardship and inflation, they also stimulated industry and modernized financial administration. The creation of uniform weights, measures, and internal markets promoted a more integrated national economy. In short, the revolution destroyed feudalism not just politically, but economically. Property became a right guaranteed by law rather than a privilege enforced by hierarchy. Beyond France, the revolution's ideas spread across Europe and the wider world. Revolutionary armies, under generals like Napoleon Bonaparte, carried the principles of equality before the law, secular governance, and national self-determination into territories from Italy to the Netherlands, from Switzerland to Poland. Monarchies everywhere viewed the revolution as a contagion threatening their legitimacy. Yet even its opponents could not ignore its ideological power. Concepts such as popular sovereignty, citizenship, and human rights began to reshape European and colonial societies alike. In Latin America, figures such as Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín drew inspiration from the revolution's ideals when pursuing independence from Spain. In Haiti, enslaved people rose against French colonial rule in 1791, launching the world's first successful slave revolt and establishing the first Black Republic. Directly influenced by revolutionary principles of liberty and equality, even as France itself hesitated to apply them universally. The revolution's intellectual legacy extended further still. It defined the vocabulary of modern political debate: left and right, liberty and order, radical and conservative. It inspired liberalism, challenged monarchy, and gave birth to both democratic and nationalist movements across the 19th century. Yet the revolution's legacy is also marked by contradiction. The same movement that proclaimed universal rights unleashed terror and censorship. Its war for liberty led to conquest. Its calls for equality left women and slaves excluded from full citizenship. The Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, 1791, written by Olympe de Gouges, demanded gender equality but was rejected by the revolutionary leadership. De Gouges herself was executed during the Terror. The revolution's universalism was, in practice, limited, but its rhetoric opened the door for future generations to challenge that exclusion. Similarly, the abolition of slavery in 1794, a radical step for its time, was reversed under Napoleon in 1802, illustrating the fragility of revolutionary progress when confronted with political expediency. Despite these contradictions, the revolution's long-term impact cannot be dismissed. It permanently changed how people conceived of authority, legitimacy, and rights. No king in Europe could ever again rule unquestioned by divine right. Every government thereafter would have to reckon with the idea that power comes from the consent of the governed. Certain images and institutions from the revolution became enduring symbols of French identity. The tricolor flag, adopted in 1794, replaced royal emblems and became a symbol of unity between the monarchy, white, and the people, red and blue of Paris. The Marseillaise, first sung in 1792, became the anthem of Republican resistance. The guillotine, grim though it was, symbolized the revolution's insistence on equality before death, a mechanized justice without privilege. These symbols outlived the revolution itself, reappearing during later uprisings in 1830, 1848, and beyond. They became part of a civic religion that celebrated the revolution as the birth of modern France. By 1799, France had emerged profoundly changed. Its institutions were secular, its laws rationalized, and its people newly conscious of their political power. The revolution had failed to achieve a lasting democratic republic, but it had succeeded in making democracy a permanent part of the political imagination. The principles of 1789, citizenship, equality, merit, and secular governance, became the foundation of the modern French state. Even under Napoleon's empire, the civil code, the administrative prefect system, and the merit-based bureaucracy preserved the revolution's core achievements. When the Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1814, it could never fully undo what the revolution had established. Feudal rights did not return, property remained secure, the new social order endured. When the dust of the French Revolution settled in 1799, the reverberations did not stop at France's borders. The revolution had detonated an ideological explosion that rippled across continents, shaping governments, economies, and cultures for centuries to come. Its decade of upheaval, 1789 to 1799, was not an isolated national crisis, but the ignition point for modern politics itself. This final segment traces how the revolution's ideas spread, evolved, and reshaped the world that followed, from Europe's monarchies and colonial empires to new republics rising in the Americas and beyond. Europe watched France's revolution with a mix of terror and fascination. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 broke centuries of dynastic precedent, a king judged by his subjects. Monarchs across the continent recognized this as an existential threat. The First Coalition, 1793 to 1797, a military alliance of Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and several smaller states, formed to crush the revolutionary experiment before it spread. But the result was the opposite. The French army, motivated by nationalism and reorganized under the levée en masse, mass conscription of 1793, began defeating Europe's old professional armies. By the mid-1790s, French victories in Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern Italy turned revolution into export. In conquered territories, French administrators dismantled feudal privileges, spread the metric system, introduced civil equality, and established sister republics. The Batavian Republic in the Netherlands, the Cisalpine Republic in Italy, and others across the Rhine. The Holy Roman Empire, already in decline, began to fracture under revolutionary and Napoleonic pressure, culminating in its dissolution in 1806. The revolution thus destroyed Europe's medieval political order more thoroughly than any prior war. Before 1789, most Europeans identified with local regions, monarchs, or churches. The revolution gave rise to a new and powerful identity, the nation. The idea that sovereignty resided in the people, not a ruler, became contagious. Citizens now sang the Marseillaise and fought for la patrie, not for dynastic loyalty. This sense of collective belonging inspired later nationalist movements across Europe. From Italy's Risorgimento to Germany's unification, the revolutionary model showed that the people could define a nation's destiny. However, nationalism also carried darker consequences. The same patriotic energy that had defended France from invasion would, under Napoleon, fuel imperial conquest. The revolution had given the world both the principle of self-determination and the precedent for ideological warfare. The most direct and radical echo of 1789 erupted not in Europe, but in the Caribbean. In Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, enslaved Africans and free people of color absorbed the revolution's declarations of liberty and equality and demanded they apply universally. In August 1791, a massive slave uprising began, led by figures such as Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Henri Christophe. The conflict devastated the colony but forced the French government to confront its contradictions. Under pressure from events and radical deputies in Paris, the National Convention abolished slavery on February 4, 1794, the first major European power to do so. This decision was revolutionary in every sense. Yet when Napoleon Bonaparte came to power, he reinstated slavery in 1802 in the Caribbean colonies, seeking to restore the old economic order. Haiti's revolutionaries refused submission. After years of warfare, they defeated French forces and declared independence on January 1, 1804, establishing the first Black Republic in the world. The Haitian Revolution was both a triumph and a warning. It proved that the principles of 1789, liberty and equality, had universal reach. But it also revealed the deep hypocrisies within France and Europe's racial and colonial hierarchies. The French Revolution's rhetoric of freedom and equality resonated across the Atlantic. In Latin America, Creole elites and independence leaders studied its writings and followed its news closely. Figures like Simón Bolívar in Venezuela, José de San Martín in Argentina, and Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico all cited the revolution's ideals as inspiration. The notion that legitimate government must rest on the consent of the governed provided an intellectual foundation for independence movements against Spanish and Portuguese rule in the early 19th century. In North America, reactions were mixed. The United States, having recently completed its own revolution, 1776 to 1783, watched France's turmoil with both admiration and caution. While Thomas Jefferson praised the revolution's ideals, Alexander Hamilton and others feared its descent into anarchy. Nonetheless, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, drafted partly under the influence of Jefferson's principles, became a transatlantic document linking the Enlightenment's two great revolutions. Philosophically, the French Revolution reshaped the structure of political thought. It marked the transition from Enlightenment reform to modern ideology. After 1789, thinkers began to frame politics not as the art of governance, but as a struggle over human rights, equality, and the nature of justice itself. Liberalism emerged from the revolution's defense of individual rights and constitutional limits. Conservatism, represented by figures like Edmund Burke, arose in reaction, warning of the dangers of rapid change and social upheaval. Meanwhile, early forms of socialism and republicanism took shape in response to the revolution's unfulfilled promises of economic equality. In this way, the revolution created the ideological spectrum that still defines modern politics: liberty versus order, reform versus tradition, equality versus hierarchy. The revolution opened debates that would not be resolved for centuries. Women like Olympe de Gouges, author of the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the female citizen, 1791, demanded that liberty and equality extend to women. Her writings challenged male revolutionaries' narrow definition of citizenship, exposing the contradictions within their universalist claims. Though she was executed during the Terror, her ideas endured, influencing later feminist movements in Europe and America. Similarly, the revolution's early throughout the 19th century, revolutions across Europe in 1830, 1848, and 1871 invoked 1789 as their moral ancestor. Workers, students, and reformers saw themselves as heirs of the revolution's unfinished promises. Its impact also extended to the colonial world. From India's independence movements to African decolonization, leaders repeatedly invoked the principles of liberty and self-determination first declared in France. Even the revolutions of the 20th century, in Russia, 1917, China, 1911, and 1949, and elsewhere, were influenced by the French precedent of overthrowing entrenched regimes in the name of the people. The French Revolution thus became a permanent reference point in the global imagination, both a warning about excess and a model of possibility. 2 centuries later, the revolution still divides opinion. To some, it represents the birth of modern democracy. To others, the beginning of totalitarian politics. Both views capture part of the truth. The revolution proved that ordinary people could overthrow tyranny, but also that liberty without restraint can devolve into terror. It gave the world ideals of equality and citizenship, yet exposed how fragile they are under pressure. Its institutions, the metric system, secular schools, civil codes, and national identity, endure. Its questions about justice, representation, and rights remain unresolved. In this sense, the revolution never truly ended in 1799. It continues in every demand for political reform, every movement for equality, every challenge to arbitrary power. The French Revolution began as a financial crisis in a kingdom burdened by debt and privilege. It became the most transformative political event in modern history. It destroyed monarchy, feudalism, and clerical dominance. It replaced divine right with the sovereignty of the people. It gave the world a new language, rights, nation, citizen, revolution, that still shapes our era. Its failures are as instructive as its triumphs. The bloodshed of the Reign of Terror, the suppression of women's rights, and the return to empire under Napoleon all remind us that revolutions consume themselves when ideals are not tempered by justice. But despite the chaos, the revolution's central achievement endures. It made freedom, equality, and popular sovereignty permanent features of the human political landscape. No empire, monarch, or ideology has since been able to erase them. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, was not just a decade of French history. It was the turning point of the modern age, the moment humanity began to question who should rule and by what right. Its echoes live in every constitution, every protest for democracy, every debate about the limits of power. From the storming of the Bastille to the rise of Napoleon, the revolution's message remains the same. History belongs to the people who demand to shape it.